consists of two sections. The first portion is a continuation of Surah Hud, and the second portion is Surah Yusuf. And we discussed in yesterday's session that it's the beginning of a new theme with respect to the titles of the chapters. The first surah that was titled after a prophet was Surah Yunus. And all these surahs that preceded Surah Yunus had varying titles that weren't the names of prophets. So now we have a correlating pattern. Now after the Surah Yunus came Surah Hud. And after Surah Hud will come Surah Yusuf. So we're going to continue from Surah Hud, verse 5, up until the remainder of this chapter. And thereafter we'll explore Surah Yusuf up until approximately verse 90, which will take us to the end of Juz 12. So in Surah Hud, Allah chooses a very interesting theme. And if this theme could have a title ascribed to it, it would be human disobedience. Allah speaks about the disobedience of human beings over the course of centuries, thousands of years before the existence of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a Meccan chapter. So in essence, these are stories, parables and lessons that are being conveyed to the Meccans, who despite having had all the truth conveyed to them, they persisted in disbelief and mockery of the messenger who was sent to them. So Allah chose to relate to them stories of previous prophets and the repercussions of their people who chose to disbelieve in them and reject them despite the evidences being as clear as daylight. So Allah Azza wa Jal narrates approximately 7 stories, the stories of 7 prophets. The first story he explores is the story of Nuh alayhi salam. Allah makes mention of the relentlessness that Nuh displayed when calling his people to the correct path. Allah goes on to mention some of the sacrifices that our Prophet Nuh, he made in the path of calling people to the monotheistic faith. Among them was his son, who despite all his efforts to try and guide his family and his relatives and the wider community, his very son ended up being among those who disbelieved openly, trying to escape the punishment of Allah when it befell the people who lived in that particular town. And Allah tells us that when Nuh said to his son that, "Oh my son, where are you fleeing to?" And his son replied very ignorantly that, "I am going to a mountain that will protect me from the wrath that is dawning upon us," i.e. the punishment of Allah. To which Nuh, he cried and he said, "Oh my son, there's no protector from Allah's wrath today." And it teaches us that relationships are not defined by blood, rather they're defined by iman. And that's when Nuh said, "Oh Allah, you haven't saved my family." And Allah responded within this chapter that, "Oh Nuh, your family are those who believed, those who boarded the ship that you built, as per my request and commandment." Many valuable lessons that are hidden within this incident, the story. The next story is the story of Hud. Who was Hud sent to? Which people? Hud was sent to the people of Ad. And these were also people who disbelieved. There's a correlating pattern. All of these prophets, first of all, are born into villages and cities. And all of these prophets, they mingled with the people of that town. So every person in that town knew very well who the prophets were, how they were as children, their behavior, their etiquettes, their integrity, their habits, their likes, their dislikes. And that's the divine wisdom of sending these people, given that their people knew of them very clearly. So Allah rendered these special individuals who were chosen by Him divinely to be prophets and messengers. And Hud was also one of them. So when Hud was sent to his people, they disbelieved. And the people of Ad were very blessed and very enriched. Certain reports suggest that they would carve houses in the mountains with their bare hands. Allah hadn't only bestowed upon them wealth and agriculture, He also gave them the blessing of indescribable strength and size. And this was something they exploited. They chose to prey upon the weak and to violate the laws that Allah had set for them. As a result of this, Allah tells us within this chapter and other chapters throughout the Quranic discourse that they were obliterated. The next story that's narrated to us is the story of Salih. Who are the people that Salih was sent to? Anybody? Thamud. The people that Salih was sent to were the people of Thamud. And there were similar tests and trials that they were faced with. And the response was very much similar to the response of previous nations. They rejected Salih. In fact, they mocked him. That this man who grew up as a boy in front of our eyes, now he's going to stand here and proclaim prophecy. That we're not going to bow to him, we're not going to submit to his commandments. And one of the incidents that occurred, that's narrated within many, many chapters in the Qur'an, is the incident of the she-camel. That there was a she-camel that was rendered sacred by Allah. And these people, they were told to respect and revere the she-camel. But despite all the commandments, despite all the polite requests, they failed to revere Allah's sign, Allah's symbols and His rights. And they slaughtered the she-camel. And Allah narrates to us the punishment that consumed these people as a result of their relentless disobedience. Allah then goes on to speak about the story of Ibrahim briefly, but to speak about the story of the nephew of Ibrahim. Who was the nephew of Ibrahim? Anybody? Who was the nephew of Ibrahim alayhi salam? Lut was the nephew of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Lut informs us in this chapter, Ibrahim is telling us that he's providing Lut with the blueprint on what his people are going to say, and trying to instill patience and steadfastness and integrity and resolve within him. And Allah tells us that Lut was sent to a people who were afflicted with homosexuality. And as a result of their disobedience and their immorality and their abnormality, Allah Azza wa Jal, He turned that town upside down. And those people were obliterated. Right, there's a correlating pattern. He then goes on to talk about the story of Shu'aib and the story of Moses. And these stories, they are symbolic of human disobedience, teaching us that these people, despite having clear signs sent to them, they chose to disbelieve and reject Allah's favors upon them. Because what's the purpose of messengers and prophets being sent to people? This is also a lesson that's inadvertently taught to us within this chapter. The purpose behind the sending of prophets and messengers is through Allah's mercy, so the people don't have an excuse that, oh, the message of Islam never reached me. And this is conveyed to us within the Quranic discourse. That Allah says, I sent a messenger to every people who spoke the language of his people, understood their habits and their practices. So on the day of judgment, it cannot be said to me that I did not know. Allah has established a hujjah, an evidence and a proof on the people. And this is the fundamental purpose behind the appointment of messengers and prophets. Allah then, He transitions into the next section, which is the surah of Yusuf alayhi salam. What's special about the surah of Yusuf compared to other surahs that discuss the lives of the prophets? Anybody? Sorry? It was revealed in one go, in chronological order. Yes, excellent. The story of Yusuf was the only surah in the Qur'an regarding a story of the Prophet that was revealed in chronological order. All other stories in the Qur'an of prophets, they were scattered throughout the book. You find the story of Moses towards the end, the middle, and the beginning of the Qur'an. You find the story of Nuh similarly in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. And the incidents that are narrated to us to take heed from are very much scattered. They're not in an ordered fashion. But the story of Yusuf is the only story in the Quranic discourse that's narrated to us in a chronological order. And some of the scholars of Qur'an would often say, كَادَ الْقُرْآنُ أَنْ يَكُونَ مُوسَى. That the Qur'an itself, it almost became about certain prophets. And among them was Musa. His story was the most oft mentioned. And certain scholars say after Musa, Yusuf was the one who had the greatest station, because his story came in a chronological order. Towards the first 90 verses of this chapter, Allah narrates to us the incidents that occurred towards the upbringing of Yusuf and the trials he faced in Egypt. So Yusuf was a young, handsome, talented young boy, and he had other brothers. And his brothers, they envied him from a very young age. given that he was preferred over them, because there was something innately special about him. And that's the nature of all prophets. And when Yusuf saw his dream, which was a direct sign of prophecy, Yaqub alayhi salam said, you've seen the planets, the sun, the stars, the moons, everything prostrating to you. Do not go and convey this to your brothers. Because Yaqub, having had life experience, having been somebody who had intuition, he knew that the brothers would become jealous of him. And they would act upon that jealousy and commit some sort of atrocity. And that's exactly what happened. The brothers, they conspired to kill him. After Yusuf was thrown into the well, with the attempt to kill him, he was found by some travelers. These travelers took Yusuf to Egypt and they sold him in the marketplace for a very cheap price. Later on, he was purchased by the king. And he went through so much trouble, just being a young boy being trapped in a gloomy, dark well, consumed by loneliness and fear and anxiety, not having the love of his father, not having the companionship of those who cared for him and nourished him. And then now he's been taken and snatched into a completely different town, city, house. And then he's accused by the wife of the very king who took him in of having committed an immoral action with him. And when Yusuf went and proved to the people, using his shirt that she ripped, that in fact she's the one who seduced me. And my response to her was, I fear my Lord who's given me refuge and sustenance in this world. I would never commit such an immoral action. He was placed into prison. In prison, he met certain people. As a result of having met those people, he was able to then come out and work for the local king. And Yusuf's story is very interesting, and it teaches us many lessons. And it stops approximately towards this point of the story, where the king now wants Yusuf to become a formal interpreter of his dreams, given that he's realized that Allah has given Yusuf the ability to foresee certain events. And that's a direct sign of his prophecy. What are some of the lessons we learn from Surah Hud and the beginning of Surah Yusuf? The first lesson we learn is, although Surah Hud discusses human disobedience with respect to people who haven't yet believed, the lesson that we can learn from that type of disobedience is Allah sometimes sends us forms of help and assistance and knowledge that we reject on a day-to-day basis. And I think one of the things that we tend to neglect is the help of other people. Sometimes we might be going through certain difficulties, and Allah sends us signs, He sends us help, and we interpret this as having no divine assistance. What we're told within Hadith and Qur'an, that Allah is always sending divine help. But we interpret the wrong to be the good and the good to be the wrong. And that's why Allah tells us in the Qur'an again and again that Allah knows what's best for you and you do not know what's best for yourselves. So the first lesson is, although we have the blessing of Iman, we can sometimes deny Allah's favors upon us. Whether it's through rejecting His help, it's through becoming unthankful and ungrateful, it's not reflecting upon the food, the water, the clothing and the shelter that we have at our disposal. We can become ungrateful and reject His favors through other mediums. It doesn't have to necessarily be through rejecting Iman in and of itself. So the first lesson is a lesson of thankfulness, being dutiful to Him through expressing our thanks. لَإِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. And Allah tells us that being thankful to Him is a direct way of increasing sustenance. The next lesson that we learn is of patience and resolve. When going through test and trial in life, we sometimes speak about troubles and problems in this world as if we have a choice. When you're afflicted with a problem, a trial, a catastrophe, you have no option but to be patient. The only other option is to give up. And that's why Imam al-Shafi'i would often say that the one who's not able to exercise patience in the face of calamity, he might as well wish death upon himself. Because patience is the only option we have. And this is something that becomes very evident throughout the story of Yusuf. He went through test after test, hurdle after hurdle, persecution after persecution. But he never showed any signs of discontentment or demoralization. Rather, he continued being patient. He had that resolve and he was content with Allah's decree. I think the one lesson we learn here is a lesson of patience. And the Prophet ﷺ, in a very famous hadith where he speaks about the amazing nature of the believing person, عَجَبًا لِأَمْرِ الْمُؤْمِنِ, that strange is the affair of the believer. That when a calamity befalls him, he's patient. And that's good for him. And then he continues to say something very phenomenal. Allah, the Prophet says, and that's for nobody but the believing person. Meaning, not everybody is able to be patient in the face of a calamity. Not everyone has the capacity and the ability to praise Allah in the face of troubles, financial troubles, marital problems, loss of loved ones. There are only a selected group of people who have the blessing of being able to carry out this spiritual behavior. And they are the mu'mineen. That when a difficulty befalls them, they are patient. And when ease comes to them, they are thankful. And this relates to our first point of not being of those who reject Allah's favors. And last but not least, another lesson we learn from the story of Yusuf is we don't know what's good and what's bad. Very crucial. When something happens, whether it's a car accident, it's being admitted into hospital, it's the injury of a loved one, it's our children falling unwell, someone being diagnosed with a chronic illness, losing a job, we interpret these things to be inherently wrong and of no benefit for us, based upon our deficient faculties and minds. Not understanding that what's good and bad for us, that knowledge lies with our Creator. We can't fathom His administration of our worldly affairs. And that's one thing we learned, that when Yusuf ﷺ was sent to prison, if he hadn't gone to prison, he would never have had his innocence declared. His innocence was declared after he was released from prison because of the request of the king who wanted Yusuf to become an interpreter for him. So if Yusuf wasn't accused and ridiculed and sent to prison, he would have remained outside of prison, but the accusation of being a fornicator would have stuck with him, alayhi salatu wassalam. But through having gone to prison, he met people of influence and authority. He saved a populace of people from disbelief and doubts and contention. And he made networks with the likes of the king, who he then became an interpreter for. And slowly he was rendered the person who was in charge of the treasure of that time. And that led to an abundance of benefits, politically and economically, which we'll discuss in the next session. So these are the three lessons we learned. The first is to not reject Allah's favors upon us, even though we are believing people. The second is to patience. The second was patience, to be patient in the face of troubles and calamities. And the last one is to understand that the good and bad isn't always in line with our deficient understanding. Allah has complete knowledge of what's good and bad for us. We ask Allah for tawfiq, and we ask Allah to allow us to connect to His book. وَأَقُولُ قَوْلِي هَذَا وَأَسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ لِي وَلَكُمْ